Good. Well, thanks very much. That was an inspiring word from Doug. Very grateful for that, and our praise from Denmark. Excellent. We've enjoyed hearing Roy Moran and John King speaking to us during our conference from the disciple making movement perspective. A number of people have just been asking a little bit about that phrase and what it means and what the background is. We're really talking about a biblical move of God, even an Acts of the Apostles move of the Holy Spirit, where we see God on the move, people becoming disciples rapidly in a multiplying process, with church planting high on the agenda. It's definitely a move of God, as Doug has underlined to us. It's about Holy Spirit activity, something that he's doing, but it's matched by people discovering Christ in dramatic ways, passionately obeying him and going on mission. A lot of this is really about our expectations. It's dynamic, progressive and purposeful, rather than slow or static, drifting and hoping for the best. So what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to Roy Moran as he's recorded again today's message, and then hopefully we'll be able to do some questions and answers together. Can I again remind you to send questions into the chat room, and then we'll put them to Roy and to John as we move forward today. So over to Roy in his recording.
Hey, Salt and Light community, good to be with you again. I want to take this opportunity to just talk to you about some of the things I've learned as I've pursued the idea of how to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. Oftentimes, there are communities that use the term movement. They think about idea of 4 generations of disciples that multiply, and when you make disciples, you always get the church if your disciples are those who are learning obedience to everything that Jesus commanded. So disciples develop these redemptive communities, these ecclesias, that are redemptive outposts that continue to multiply the impact, the transforming impact of the good news of Jesus Christ into their communities. And as we start to make disciples who make disciples, it's a kind of mindset shift that I talked about earlier that begins to feel as if our skin is maybe being ripped off, or our insides are being pulled out, or there's this real sense that something's changing. It reminds me of being in a liminal state. I don't know if you're familiar with that word, liminality, but it's a little bit like when you first wake up in the morning. Sometimes when I wake up in the morning, especially as I'm traveling, I don't know where I'm at. I wake up and I'm not sure if I'm awake or I'm asleep. And as we begin to make this mindset shift and we begin to move toward making disciples who make disciples, it challenges the very forms that we use, the idea of collecting people once a week and thinking that we can do everything there in that type of organization. Or maybe if that's the operating system, maybe we add a couple apps to it because that's not enough. And so we add small groups to the process. And that's not enough. And so we add some kind of discipleship program to get people to grow deeper. And if that's not enough, we add a men's ministry and a women's ministry. And all of a sudden, we've got all this activity. But if you're like me, I like to take a ruthlessly honest look at the outcomes of what's happening from my activity. And when I did, I discovered that I was not making disciples who made disciples. I made disciples from the moment I was 16 years old or 17 years old, when I began to understand who Jesus was, why he came, why he lived and died and rose again. And I began to orient my life around that. I realized that Jesus had called me to make disciples. And so from that moment, I began the process of investing in the lives of other people. But I discovered something that was really painful. I did a timeline or a family tree of all of the men and women that I had affected. And I discovered that I could make disciples. I could see people come from atheists to all the way to kind of into embracing the cross and living out a Jesus first type of lifestyle. I could see that happen. But my disciples were not making disciples. And that was disturbing to me because I came across a moment when I'm journaling on Matthew 28, and I tend to write the scriptures out, copy the scriptures by hand. There's never a time in my life when I read so clearly. It's when I'm copying the scriptures. And so I'm copying this down, and I ask myself, what's the implication of this passage for my disciples? And the reality is that the implication was that they should be making disciples. And I had this harsh revelation that Jesus didn't call me to make disciples. Now, I know that sounds odd because of all that I've been saying, but the reality is that Jesus called me to make disciples who make disciples. And there's a slight difference, but it's a vast difference in relationship to Jesus's strategy of reaching the world. He didn't call me to make one-off disciples and see people's lives get better. He called me to invest in the lives of people so they can in turn invest in the lives of people, so they can in turn invest in the lives of people, so they can in turn invest in the lives of people. And I had the harsh reality that faced me when I realized that my methodology was what was holding me back. I had used the kinds of methodologies that I was trained in. I love languages. I love theology. I love to read really difficult books. I love to ask people really difficult questions. I'm just given to that kind of thing. And so that's the way I was discipling people. And I discovered that they couldn't do what I was doing because they weren't me. They weren't gifted the way I was. They didn't have the same passions I have. They didn't have the same temperament I have. And so my methodologies weren't really providing me the opportunity to see my disciples make disciples and see their disciples make disciples. And that's what drew me to these folks that are written about in Miraculous Movements, a book that maybe you've read, some of you have, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to read it. It's about God's movement across sub-Saharan Africa, and this team of people, now flying under the name of New Generations, this team of people had really crafted a unique way of watching God make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. And that challenged my own understanding, and it challenged my methodologies really, and it caused me to go through a whole radical change as I implemented this strategy. Some people call it a disciple making movement, or DMM for short, but the reality is it's just simply disciples who make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. It's the adopting of strategy that will allow itself to repeat and to be sustainable and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. I believe that's the way that Jesus had intended to reach the entire world. When he gave us the Great Commission, he says, go to all the world, go to every ethne, ta ethne, go to every ethne. So everything outside the Jewish faith, basically saying, look, go everywhere. And that has a kind of finality to it, has an extent to it. It's the globe, it's everywhere. And so over the last 12 years, I've been involved in attempting to take a local fellowship of believers and to be able to reorient them around a multiplicative disciple-making strategy, disciples who make disciples who make disciples, and to help them learn how do they plant the gospel where they live, learn, work, and play, and watch the gospel planted in such a way that it can repeat over and over and over in the lives of people. And along the way, I've learned a few things. And so I just want to take a few minutes to talk to you about the realities of changing directions. Now, I still work at Shoal Creek Community Church. We still have a Sunday morning meeting, a children's program. We still collect money. We still sing songs and all that kind of stuff. So if you read in Spent Matches, I developed this concept I call the hybrid church, and just the idea that you can have two different engines in the same automobile, and they, even though they are radically different, they still serve the same purpose, transportation. And we use that kind of methodology or that kind of metaphor to really help us understand that we still collect people on Sunday, but that's not the primary or necessarily will be the primary way that God reaches our community. It's when the gospel moves away from us, that's the way that Jesus will reach our community. And as I've come to grips with this journey that I've been on, I've come to some really, I would say, hard lessons, but maybe easy lessons. It depends on which glasses you want to put on to look at it. And so the first one I came to about 5 years into it to realize that I was trying to answer the wrong problem, or at least I had framed the problem that I had the wrong way. I thought I had a training problem. So I just take some training back to people and help them gospel in a different way. And so as I took some training back, I taught them how to do discovery Bible study. I taught them how to identify persons of peace. I taught them, how it is that they lead in a certain way to be able to multiply those groups rather than grow them. And all of these principles that come out of this whole movement world and understanding how do we rapidly multiply the gospel. And I realized that it wasn't a training problem. And we did a lot of training. I mean, we did a lot of training with these folks. And that training was good and it was helpful. And many of them were extremely impacted by it. But the reality is that my problem wasn't a training problem. My problem was a culture problem. I had built a culture of collecting people. And these people had been won in that way. There's a little phrase that a mentor of mine, Harry Brown, uses. Harry says that what you're one with is what you're one to. And that's true. If you came to faith at a Billy Graham crusade, then you think Billy Graham crusades are the thing that could win everyone. If you came to faith as a youth person at a camp, then you think that youth camps would be the way to go. And if you came to faith through a sports ministry, then you have a real investment in sports ministry. If you came to a church and you went forward, or you got involved in a small group and people loved on you and you became a follower of Jesus that way, then you're one to that methodology. You owe your eternity to it. And so oftentimes we get so caught up in how we were one that we fail to realize that there are many other ways. And the way we were one is not necessarily a way that can multiply and create more and more disciples. And so I had built a culture where people bring people on Sunday morning to a very exciting type of service that would provide them an opportunity to hear a very creative, very insightful, very artistic expression of biblical truth. And as a result of that, they would start a discussion about Jesus and his place in this world and their life and their response to it. And so I had a culture, and culture is basically language and repeated customs. And so we here in this conference come from many, many different cultures. And I know I'm in a different culture when I hear a different language. And I see different foods, I see different dress, I see different ways of greeting people. It tells me I'm in a different culture. Well, you and I as local church fellowship leaders, we have built cultures, we built customs and habits and language that people love. And many of them have been won to faith, and they owe their eternity on the cultures we built. And so when you and I come and decide to change that culture, it gets hard. And so I realized quickly that that I didn't have a training problem, I had a culture problem. And you really don't change cultures. You really don't come in and just, blow up a culture and change it. And so I had to realize that there was a real critical wisdom that came in and trying to change things and trying to really move things along. And one of those was a research project that was done in the US in the agricultural farming industry. It was done by a guy named Everett Rogers, and it's called The Diffusions of Innovation, the book that he wrote about it. And it has a very famous bell curve in it that I'm sure many of you've seen. And that bell curve just moves up and down like that. And in it, you draw certain vertical lines across that bell curve. And on the left-hand side, you get 16% of the people who end up being early adopters and innovators. So these innovators and early adopters represent 16% of the population. 84% of the population is represented by late adopters and a number of other words used to describe people. But the difference between the 16% and the 84% are the fact that the 16% of the people are people who listen to and respond to a language of scarcity. The 84% are the people who listen and respond to a language of social proof. And so you see why Jesus, when he comes along, he doesn't really trust the masses. Jesus works with a few to win the many. And unfortunately, I think modern ministry, we've turned it around and we try to use the many to reach the few. And so we have been going backwards to kind of recapture Jesus's win the few or work with the few to win the many. And so we began to establish a small culture amongst a team of people. I realized early on that this idea of disciple making, and especially the concept of a disciple making movement, where you're going to get this large, rapid growth of the gospel, it's a team sport. And you need a team to do it. And so I would encourage you, if you're thinking in terms of implementing or moving in this direction, that you think first team. How do I build a team? How do I find those people who listen to the language of scarcity? Who are my early adopters? Who are my innovators? Who are the people that see that change needs to happen? And that you leave the 84% alone. That you don't try to convince those who are convinced by social proof, because you don't have any right now. You don't look at new methodologies and say, okay, this is producing this. You don't have any argument with them. So let them be. And that's why we continue almost things as usual at Shoal Creek on our platform of our campus and people coming. That's stayed the same. But we built a small team of people who began to rethink how gospeling could take place. And that small team of people had a rhythm to it, and it had a language to it. We use a training developed by New Generations called Habits of Multiplying Disciples to help people understand that there's this flywheel that you have to turn. And there's a process you have to go through. You have to learn what it means to be a disciple, learning obedience to all Jesus commanded. And then once you've learned that kind of rhythm in your life, then you can become a multiplying disciple. Then you can begin to really move into the lives of others. And once you become a multiplying disciple, then you have the ability to start to see that you become a disciple of multiplying disciples. That you're leading a group of people who are beginning to multiply. If you were good at math, you know that all those words add up to a lot of numbers. And so the necessity to continue to work at coaching and nurturing people and building a system that can coach and nurture those people are radically important in that process. But it's a team process. And so I really encourage everyone starting out. I wish I would have worked harder at building a team. I had the privilege of being coached regularly, and I see so many people who start down the path of trying to implement a new methodology, a new tactic to do gospeling in their area, and they fail to understand the need for a coach. I mean, every great athlete in our world, no matter what discipline they're in, they always have a coach. musicians, anybody that performs at a high level. It's amazing how important they believe that the coaching process is. And so I really encourage you to think about, who is going to help coach me into this process and help me get there. This process for me has been a lot harder than I thought. I'm standing here in an old house. It's 115 years old. And my wife and I have had the privilege over the last 30 years of remodeling it almost completely now. We've almost touched every piece of the old house and made it new again. But one of the things we discovered is that the old adage about remodeling is absolutely true. It costs twice as much and takes twice as long as you think. And remodeling a culture is the same way. It's radically important that you get that in your mind. Now, if I were to show you growth charts of what happened in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, and show you some of the amazing numbers, the approaching 2 million disciples and 70,000 churches and that kind of stuff, I mean, it's almost unbelievable to us. But if you look closely, if you go all the way back to the very beginning, you'll see that there were 5 or 6 years of real pain where nothing happened, where they paid their dues to really get the reconstruction process all the way down. When we work on this house here, we have to realize is that when we tear out something, we have to tear it down until we get something solid. We can't start rebuilding too quickly, because if we do, that which we build will be built on a pretty flimsy foundation. And so the same thing's true. It's a lot of deconstruction that has to take place here. In fact, I would suggest that I'm still in the process of deconstructing. There's still things that I don't know that I don't know. And so I'm still learning and seeing where these inside I've been wired by the history of Christianity that I've grown up in, that have embedded in me things that when they're pulled out to the light and shown to the light of biblical truth, they don't necessarily hold up, but I held to them dearly, simply because that's the way I grew up, and it's the way I was taught. It was the culture that I was built in as a Christian. And so there is if I could go back to this concept of liminality for a moment, there is a sense in which you're constantly living in two different worlds, and you're learning about both worlds. And the realization of being able to handle that liminality, that sense of things not being right, or at least it feels sometimes to me like my feet are not set on solid ground. And so sometimes I feel like I'm on one of those boards with a ball underneath it. I'm just back and forth and wobbling and stuff like that. But it's a process by which it helps me understand how I need to have a beginner's spirit all the time. I have a tendency to want to be a person who knows everything. I have a fear of missing out, and so I gobble up information. My wife swears that I'm an informivore. That is, I just eat information daily because I try to find the end of the internet, and I've got hundreds of emails coming in and all those kinds of things. But I've had to learn that I need to have a beginner spirit, that posture of understanding that I don't know what I don't know in this process. And as I have figured that out, it helps me live in that liminality and understand exactly what's going on in my world and why that's happening. One of the hard things for me to swallow in this process has been the fact that a friend of mine, a mentor and a coach, said to me one time, we were talking about some critical principles, and there's another mentor of both of ours who has these lists of critical principles, and one of them is expect the greatest success in the hardest places. And the reality is that he was talking about really those majority Muslim areas, those areas that were very antagonistic toward Christianity. But this mentor of mine, said to me one time, he says, have you ever thought about the fact that you might be working in one of the more hardest spots in the world? Now, I exist in a Midwestern city in the United States. The houses around me are all really nice houses. The people who live in these houses have very little need, especially financially. There's no such thing as poverty around me at all, at least in terms of finances. But there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of poverty of marriage. There's a lot of poverty of relationship. There's a ton of poverty around me. But most of the people that exist in my world don't think they have a need. And so this mentor was saying to me, you exist in a hard space. He also said, you exist in a space that has an echo of Christianity. And so there's so many people who have a knowledge of, even if they're not genuine followers of Jesus, they have a knowledge of Christianity. And they think that they know what the message of Jesus is. They think they know why Jesus came. They think they understand this religious enterprise and what it means and why or why not they're related to it. And so that echo of Christianity makes it really difficult for us, because I find that even when I'm successful, we've had young families, for instance, come to faith, and they started, reading the Bible and began to really embrace Jesus, but they quickly start coming to Sunday morning. And they get enamored by all the Christian stuff. There's this service on Sunday morning. There's a radio station that plays Christian music. There are conferences just for Christians, and all this Christian community that they're captured by. And all of a sudden they begin to float into this Christian world. And as they float into this Christian world, it robs them of that multiplicative, that sense of becoming a disciple who multiplies. They become a disciple who wants to grow rather than multiply, as I mentioned in my first message. And so the problem of working in the hardest spaces is that echo of Christianity that exists there, that oftentimes, even if it's a true vision of Jesus dying on the cross, humans in need of a father, a savior, all those kinds of very precious truths that we hold, even if it's that, they grew up in a collective community that Sunday morning is the center of gravity for their spiritual existence. And so they live from Sunday to Sunday. And the idea of planting the gospel where they live, learn, work, or play is not a reality for them, or at least they don't see the center of gravity of their spiritual existence being where they live, or where they learn, they go to school, or where they work and spend most of their time, or in the gyms or the athletic teams or the hobbies and things that they have. They don't see that being there. And so the culture sometimes, both even the Christian culture and the secular culture, work against us as we attempt to make these kinds of changes. But let me end by saying that it's important that we do this. Jesus has called us to make disciples of all nations. That was his last command. That was in a sense, that was his deathbed confession. As he's ascending to heaven, Jesus leaves us with this last command. And it was his strategy. It was his way of reaching the world. I can't imagine finishing this life on earth, coming to the finish line. And if it were a metaphor of a race, and I see the finish line, I see people down there, they're cheering, yay, and there's Jesus down there. I can't imagine approaching that finish line and Jesus looking at me and saying, okay, Roy, where are the disciples? Where are, I said, make disciples. Where are they? I can't imagine me getting there and not having been obedient to Jesus's last command. So I would just leave you with a thought that Matthew 28, 16 through 20 ought to be something that you wrap your mind, your heart, and your hands around. And as you wrap your mind, your heart, and your hands around, begin to understand how is it that Jesus is going to help you make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. That's his genuine heart interest for you and I. And that's his final command. That's the last command that he gave us. So thank you so much for letting me be here and be a part of this. And I look forward to the opportunity to dialogue with many of you around this concept, and to be able to get our head, hearts, and hands around what it means to be disciple makers, so that we do have the opportunity to see heaven come to earth as Jesus taught us to pray.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Roy. I think Roy is going to appear on our screen in a moment, but we're grateful for more provocative input from Roy. Are we going to find Roy? I'm just asking really, because the technicians should be highlighting Roy in a moment, because I know he's on the call. There we are. There we are. Thank you, Roy. Good input to us. So we have a number of questions again, and just want to keep sort of pressing home this thing. Interesting to hear what you have to say about hybrid church. We're not sort of scrapping everything, and it's not a revolution, is what you're saying, but it is a definite transformation. I think there's no question about that. Now, you're talking to a group of leaders here, and I think probably many of us would say we've been quite good at collecting people. We'd like to be even better at that, but anyway, we've been quite good at collecting people. This is a cultural issue. You've made that clear, underlined that to us, but how do we change this culture of collecting people to a multiplying culture? But what I'm asking really is, what needs to happen in us leaders to make that happen? Because it's not about them, is it? It's about us. So, if this isn't just to be empty teaching, that where we say very good, and we go away and carry on doing the same again, what changes would you say need to take place in us? I think you've hinted at some of those during this talk, but let's see if we can just be more specific. Well, we seem to have lost John. You're going to have to take up this question, because I think I've just lost Roy. Oh, he's back. There we go. Let's take Roy first, and then let's take John.
So I'm not even sure I heard the question, Steve, so maybe John should take it.
Okay, all right. John, over to you.
Part of what Roy's gone for is us thinking about our own mental picture, our game plan.
Go ahead, John.
We need to focus on raising up a team of people who will respond to the message of scarcity. The fact that the same old is going to give us the same results we've been getting. We've operated under the basic idea, if we could do what we're doing better, quicker, faster, more places, then we would get better results. But if we keep doing what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always gotten, is a way that one of my friends puts the challenge that we're facing. We're going to have to respond personally very differently. And that starts with the humility of acknowledging we don't know as much about making this change as we might wish we did. And we might presume we do. And so to make significant changes, you're going to need a coach.
Okay, so what we're saying, John, is I think there needs to be some divine dissatisfaction first.
Absolutely.
First of all, we're saying we really want to make disciples who make disciples. Of course, that's what we want. I think most people on this call would sort of say that's what we want. We're not doing so well. So we have to own up that we're not doing as well as we should. And then we have to have the humility to say, how can we do this better? do you have a supply of coaches in your back pocket that can help us in this?
There are coaches, and there are coaches in many parts of the world. Back in 2015, we did a video called Engage Africa, and we interviewed 6 world-class trainers across sub-Saharan Africa and down into South Africa. Roy can introduce people to a real strong group based out of Nairobi, Kenya. The places where churches are internationally that I've heard in this call, in this conference, there are going to be some people in those basic regions who could help coach. There's some basic learning that can be done in some online training, exposure, coaching types of settings that would be helpful as starting places. The challenge is you get those who are explorers. They're interested in finding out about this, and their needs are different than those who are practitioners. Those who are already starting and who need coaching to go to the next level. Too often we end up mixing those, and they don't fit well together, and they frustrate each other. The questions they ask are very different. The needs that they have are very different. And so if you're just starting down this road, you need some explorers training is how the language I would use. Not everybody's going to use that, but for a beginner, and be humble enough to say, I am a beginner. Don't pretend that you're further down the road than you really are in making this transition, because it will create confusion.
Yes, and so what we're beginners in leading,
making disciples who are disciple makers.
Yes,
because that's our strategy.
Okay, some of us are stuck in a mold too of church management, and we might be quite professional at that, but still very poor at making disciples.
Who make disciples?
Disciples who make disciples.
See, Jesus' strategy in the Gospels is not to disciple the whole world. It's to raise up disciple makers who will start a cyclical process of disciples being made on the way to becoming disciple makers.
Yes, yeah. So, okay, yesterday you mentioned the 72 who suddenly appear in Luke chapter 10, who we've never seen before. Luke chapter 9, 12 go, Luke chapter 10, 72 go. Big question, where did they come from? I think you were trying to say they were already in the process of being made, probably. I mean, there's obviously a development going on there.
There's some who believe, and we don't have enough information to really debate this, that the 72 are the fruit of the 12 being sent out in Luke chapter 9. There's a brief reference there, and it's either a first or a second sending out, very parallel to Matthew chapter 10, where we have more information. Jesus calls these 12, he appoints them apostles, which literally means the sent ones. And if you're naming apostles, what's the next thing you would anticipate doing? Sending them. He sends them out in Luke 9, Matthew 10, and now in Luke 10, the following chapter, as we break our chapters, and we know those were done later on, you've got 72 others.
Right.
Either Jesus had 84 disciples, or the 72 are the fruit of the efforts of these 12. And yet now he's commissioning them to go out.
Okay, so here's a very clear question that somebody sent in to us. How do we ensure that disciples we're making, and many of us are involved in discipling people, but how do we ensure that disciples we're making become disciple makers?
we need to model that for them incredibly carefully. Take them with us when we're starting from the very ground zero with a person of peace, with someone who is a spiritually interested person. Modeling, we've modeled church management better than we've modeled making disciple makers. And so we're going to have to begin a very deliberate, persistent, consistent practice of modeling, discipling people to become disciple makers, and taking our disciples with us on that process. That's what Jesus does with the 12 throughout the Gospels. He focuses most of his attention on those becoming disciple makers. We equip them in becoming capable of doing this. Then we transition into a watchful state of them doing it, and we coach them privately on how to do it better. If you go on and read there in Luke 10 with the 72, when they come back to him, they're having one incredible celebration that even the demons responded in obedience to their directives to leave the people that they're possessing. And Jesus calms their excitement and says, there's something else you really need to focus on. And so there is this, you model, you equip them, you watch them, and you help to bring correction. You help to bring a refocus of their thinking. You help them to recognize what's really going on. And it's in that context that Luke records something. It's only written once, and that's this joy in the Holy Spirit. Jesus is bubbling up with joy in the Holy Spirit because God's revealed these things to little ones. What he's just seeing is a multi-generational growth. He's discipled the 12. Potentially they've discipled these 72. Now these 72 have gone out and they've been successful, and this multi-generational replication is beginning to happen that God's longed for.
Okay, well, I mean, Roy's just put on the chat box now, people, do what we do, not what we say. So, I mean, the clear thing is this question example, which means that Roy's in this show somehow here. He's obviously, his picture is not being seen, but Roy, if you're listening to me, do you want to add something in from these questions that you've just heard? We don't want to just ignore you here.
That's quite all right. I think John's right on the money. Is that if my methodologies are built on my personality, my giftedness, then and are not replicatable, then my disciples will never make disciples. But when I have simple, repeatable methodologies that anyone can do, then you have the potential of seeing disciples make disciples make disciples. And when I do, they will do, and they will do, and they will do. And as John mentioned, they'll just keep going.
Okay, now, I mean, the truth is, I suppose, that a lot of our churches are built, and this is where you were coming from this morning, a lot of our churches are being built on gatherings, collectings, teaching the word of God, because that's important, to preaching faith, inspiring people, and so on. None of which is bad, but none of which is producing the fruits that we're really looking for long term. I mean, is that a fair summary of what you're effectively saying to us, Roy? You might have...
Yeah, I think we have to start with the end in mind. So that, the end is to make disciples, not to collect people. And so when we focus on the function that Jesus gave us, rather than the forms that we want to build, different things happen. And so if my goal line is multiplying disciples, if I measure all of my success in ministry on multiplying disciples, it will change the way I do things.
Okay, now I just want a quick testimony from both of you guys, if I can, because, I mean, you're speaking to leaders And I think we're all saying yes in our hearts. Nobody's disputing anything that you're saying, but we are not achieving what we want to achieve. Let's all be honest about this. We want to see more fruitfulness, more disciples who are going to make disciples. And we recognize that's the message and practice of Jesus. I suppose at a certain point, you both got off the church carousel, the church roundabout, and decided you were going to do something else. Now, in many ways, you're saying you're still on the church roundabout. I mean, there's still things that are happening in your hybrid church that we've always done, which are good to do. But what are the other things that you ensured you must do? What are your must-win battles as a leader to see this happen?
I think you have to find simple, repeatable methodologies.
Right.
You know, that simple, repeatable way for John and I, that would be this discovery process. That is teaching people to hear from God through the Word, teaching people to identify what they're going to obey from it, and asking them to share it with their friends, neighbors, relatives, and workmates. And that simple, repeated process over time will create multiplication. So I need to create a small culture, small team of people, meet with them on a regular basis, help them understand, how to put this into practice, build accountable structures so that over time they will see traction in their spirituality. I know for Americans at least, and I'm sure many, especially many in the West, we're addicted to success. And so we want immediate success. And this doesn't come fast. This culture building, reframing your mind takes a lot of time, effort, and energy. I was trying to explain this morning in that, you look in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, where John and I have a lot of experience, and you will see that it took them 5 to 6 years to get real traction. And so we have to be in it for the long haul and build these small teams of people with weekly rhythms. And these teams, ultimately, as they begin both to reach out to their friends, neighbors, relatives, and workmates, and lean into one another to learn together, that kind of dynamic will create multiplication.
Very good. John, final minute to you.
Everybody needs a coach. Everybody needs a cohort, to use words that sort of hang together. This team setting creates that. And then you need someone who's further along, who understands this, who has more experience, to inspire, to encourage, to help you identify where are your weak spots, where are your blind spots, what are the things that are sucking you back into spending more of your best energy on maintaining what already exists.
Very good. Thank you both. We are grateful to you both, especially Roy, with some of the time you've had coming in from Ivory Coast, but thank you very much for being with us. So we're moving on just a 15 minutes break now, asking everybody to be back, please, in 12 minutes time so that we're ready to go again. Okay, have a good break.